In this particular lesson, we're going to shift our East Asian focus from China over to Japan. Now, when we look at the island nation of Japan, made up of 4 main islands, Kyushu, Shikoku, Honshu, which has Tokyo, and Hokkaido. All right, outsiders from Korea probably arrived in about the 300s BC. So from the Korean Peninsula is where the initial settlers came. Now, most people lived on southern and central islands, where agriculture, like growing rice, was the best and fishing was abundant. So Hokkaido was more sparsely populated. It's mainly Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu that house the people. Now, the population grew, and land use was going to plague Japan throughout its history. Often, Japan is thought of as the Great Britain of Asia, although they resisted the intrusion of mainland Asia with much more success than the British resisted mainland Europe. The mountains are very sacred to Japanese history, and not only do the mountains help Japan stand out, but the fact that nearly 94% of Japan's population lives in cities. I'll say that again. 94% of the population lives in urban centers. There's 127 million people living in an area that's about the size of California. And that leads to why Tokyo is one of the largest cities in the world. Now, Japan is very compact, but it's quite mountainous and doesn't really have many long inland rivers, which made communication and trade very difficult. And by consequence, this also means that unification was going to be a tricky prospect. Through most of Japan's history, the island was ruled regionally by local warlords known as daimyo. We will see that there is an influence from China, all right, especially in the areas of Confucian principles and relationships, as we'll see with social structure, government and civil service, as well as the infusion of Buddhism. When we look at religion, Buddhism entered Japan through Korea. So Korea got it through China, which got it through India. That's the avenue through which it enters the island nation. And Zen Buddhism is how the Japanese adopted this religion. It's going to reinforce the Bushido values of mental and self-discipline. And the concept of Bushido, or the way of the warrior, sometimes the samurai code, is integral to the Japanese identity. Now, Shinto is practiced by about 80% of the population, has about 81,000 temples and 85,000 priests. It's a religion, but it's seen as somewhat secular because there's no ritual involved in becoming Shinto. You know, these traditions are tied to Japan itself, so many Japanese simply carry it on. And there are certainly elements of ancestor worship that are involved within Shinto. You know, the spirits of Japan, or the spirits of the ancestors, are often viewed as protecting the home islands, especially from invasion. Now, society is modeled more along Confucian principles. At the top, we have an emperor who doesn't necessarily have power and thus is more of what we would call a figurehead. The shogun runs the show. They are the general, and eventually they will also be the political leader. Below the shogun are the daimyo, and daimyo is a region as well as a person. These are the nobles who control local government. Now, the samurai and ronin are pretty much the same. The only difference is samurai is to serve. So any warrior who is trained and serves a specific daimyo is a samurai. Ronin are viewed with a bit more suspicion because they have warrior training, but as they don't have a master, they tend to wander and want to prove themselves. So warriors are near the top of Japanese society. About 90% of the population are peasants. They farm, they fish, they provide food. Artisans are underneath because even though they don't make food, their stuff helps produce or harvest food. And at the very bottom are the merchants, who are traditionally viewed as making nothing. Because if they're charging interest and making money, they're not viewed in a very favorable light. All right, so this explains the setup of society. And even though most of Japanese history is comprised of control by daimyo, our focus shifts to efforts to unify Japan. Now, the previous shogunate, meaning the shogun whose family was in power, they were weakened after a lengthy war, and a prolonged civil war does last the length of the late 1500s. Nobunaga Oda, and remember, last names come first, so Nobunaga Oda was the first what we might call unifiers. He unifies central Japan, which included the highly influential areas surrounding Kyoto, which is where the emperor lived. Now, eventually, he was betrayed by one of his generals, and Hideyoshi Toyotomi avenged his death and took control of Nobunaga's forces. Nobunaga had actually been accepting of European missionaries only because they offered guns, and he used them to decimate his opponents. So we begin with Nobunaga. We continue with Hideyoshi Toyotomi. Now, he's born a lowly peasant, but he rose through the ranks to continue the work of Nobunaga. While he was consolidating his power in Japan, he's a skilled peasant warrior. He doesn't care for missionaries. While he's consolidating his power, what he's most known for is planning an invasion of the Korean peninsula. Now, there were several reasons for his insistence on this invasion. He wanted to keep rival daimyo busy so that they wouldn't plot against him. He wanted to get the newly Christian daimyo out of Japan. This is where him being anti-missionary comes into play. And he wanted to send a message to his domestic enemies. Ultimately, the 100,000 plus forces that Hideyoshi sent were vastly skilled in hand-to-hand combat. The problem is that they did not count on the assistance that the Koreans would receive from the Navy of Ming China. And Ming China considered the Koreans to be part of their tribute network. The fighting consumed about 5 years, the losses were great, and soon even Hideyoshi himself lost interest in it. Now, on his deathbed, he ordered the withdrawal of all Japanese forces from the peninsula. The experience may also have caused his successor to focus solely on Japan itself, rather than on foreign lands. So Nobunaga begins unification. Hideyoshi continues it. The man who reaps the benefits is Tokugawa Ieyasu. In the year 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu asserted his dominance over all daimyo and assumed this title of shogun. He moved the administrative capital from Kyoto to Edo, and trade between the two cities would help stimulate the internal Japanese economy. Ieyasu instituted a policy known as alternate attendance, in which the daimyo lived for part of the year in their domain or in their daimyo, and the rest of the year in Edo, while their families remained in the capital year-round. The roads and maritime transport that linked these castle towns on 3 of Japan's 4 islands allowed commercial traffic to increase. Lords received their incomes in rice, and they redistributed it to their followers. Some speculators even converted rice to cash, and rice exchanges were set up in Edo and Osaka, where merchants could speculate in rice. So even though merchants are viewed at the bottom of Japanese society, there is some internal economic stimulation. Domestic industries begin to flourish. Manufacturing booms, and industries like steelmaking, pottery, and porcelain will help this. Even though the regional daimyo maintain some autonomy, the samurai will begin their decline as a warrior class, and they'll start shifting their skills to meet the growing demands of an administrative state. The samurai will become more educated, and they'll understand the tastes of this new civil elite. They were also important customers for merchants who dealt in silks, fans, sake, and other goods. Now, the domestic economy rises, but we saw that Hideyoshi had this experience of trying to conquer other areas, and it didn't go so well. The isolation edicts of the 1630s also contributed to this, where Japan mainly closed off their borders to external trade. Only the Dutch were allowed to trade on an island off of Nagasaki, and it was one time a year. Some of their materials were a bit suspect, but the ability to read and speak Dutch became a prized skill among the samurai and other elite. So as Japan becomes more unified, they will begin to close off their borders.